Hey there, Interweb. We're going to have another road trip. This time we've been invited by listener Scott Phillips to the Coonan Brewing Company at 26,000 Groesbeck Road in Clinton Township, Michigan. We're going to be meeting there on June 7th at 7:30 p.m. So hope to see you there.
And you can find details about that at the website, graceontap-podcast.com. And if you would like to be like Scott,
and everybody wants to be like Scott,
and you want to host a future road trip of Grace on Tap, shoot us an email at graceontap.podcast@gmail.com.
In February of 1519, Luther took pen in hand and wrote to his friend, John Staupitz, who Luther hadn't seen since the fall of 1518, when Staupitz ran away from Augsburg, leaving Luther alone with the Roman representative, Cardinal Cajetan.
Luther wrote, "Charles Miltitz has seen me at Altenburg. He complained that I have pulled the whole world to my side and alienated it from the Pope. He said he explored all the inns, discovered that among 5 people, there are hardly 3 or 2 who favored the Roman party."
Now, Miltitz was referencing a little reconnaissance work that he had done while he traveled between Rome and Germany on his way to meet Luther. The Pope had promoted him to the position of ambassador to either get Luther to recant his position or to bring Luther back to Rome as a prisoner. During the trip from Rome to Germany, Miltitz realized that the people of Germany mostly sided with Luther.
Miltitz knew that he had his work cut out for him. Maybe there was a third way between recanting and prison. As Miltitz approached his meeting with Luther, he decided he was now ready to seek this third way. I'm Evan Gaertner.
And I'm Mike Yagley, and this is Grace on Tap.
Grace on Tap is a podcast where we go through history and the people surrounding various documents of the Lutheran Reformation.
Now, today's episode isn't going to really focus on any specific document, but instead it's going to focus on, at least the first part of it, it's going to focus on Karl von Miltitz. He was a character mentioned over and over again in Luther's writings and in many Reformation era documents. It's something that... So who was Miltitz?
Miltitz is... First of all, he's kind of a guy who didn't do so well in Latin, wasn't going to advance as anybody on his own. He works his political connections, though, to get something special. Starting with, he was born in 1490 in Rabenau, Germany, near Dresden.
So he's a pretty young guy, right?
He's young. He's 7 years younger than Luther.
Yeah, 1490, that puts him at about this time, he's roughly coming up on 30.
Yeah. And he has a political mission that he is on. His father had died before he was born. He grows up in a tough position. There's really no one that's going to advocate for him in the family business. And so he's hoping for a career in the church to advance himself. But now a career in the church is for him, usually it doesn't succeed when you aim for the ambition. The ambition's got to find you. The church has got to find you. Over and over in history, those who are really spectacular in the life of the church, they don't seek it out.
That happens in business. I mean, in business, you get a lot of, a lot of people are ambitious, right? But you have to have the desire, the passion for what you're doing to really succeed. And church is obviously no different. So
what he does is he gets his spot in the papal court through the influence of his uncle, who was a noted friar, which is similar to a monk. Luther was a friar. And so he had a couple of jobs. Both of them are rather nominal. They're important in their name, but they're not so important in their substance.
So now the first job, at least in my research, that he had was as a papal notary, right? And from what that sounds like, at least what I was able to find, it's somebody who... basically issues documents. I
think of it kind of like a paralegal. He's a canon lawyer that prepares and draws up official, authentic documents. They're going to be part of the administrative bureau of the church.
So, and then I assume I see. I have a Catholic background. My most of my family is Catholic. And every so often you get these letters written from the Pope, that are like, oh, I don't know, congratulations on your 50th wedding anniversary or something. And then the Pope signs it.
I just watched an episode of West Wing. And Rob Lowe's character in the episode we just watched is supposed to write a birthday message from the president to the undersecretary of the Department of something. And it's an example of that. The president's going to sign it, but it was written up by somebody else.
And so it sounds like, at least as far as I could tell, this is one of Miltitz's jobs, is to go through and write these things up, make sure that now more substantial than a birthday wish, but something like I guess some of the examples that I had was administrative stuff, different things, contracts, that sort of stuff. Sort of like you said, a paralegal, where there is someone's
got to do it, and they're important roles. But I would imagine Miltitz has this growing vanity that they're maybe even his words. He forgets that he's crafting words that someone else is signing, and he thinks he's got his own voice, his own role, that he's going to be able to strike a path through this Lutheran controversy, this Luther guy, and come up to a solution that no one else has come up with.
So this is Miltitz's jobs before his promotion.
Yeah.
So before his promotion, he was a papal notary, but he had a second job, and that second job they call him a titular chamberlain.
So let's explain that first word. Titular is just a title position. Usually, if you say, for instance, Cajetan was the titular priest at a church in Rome, meaning that was by name where he was the priest, but Cajetan didn't serve there.
Okay. So what that basically means is that because the chamberlain, a papal chamberlain, when I was doing my research on this, the papal chamberlains would be like, kings would be the papal chamberlains, and princes would be the papal and there's this whole there's an outfit that they wear, and there's goes into there's a chain and all that it's a
very a position with a lot of honor.
A lot of honor, exactly. And so it's sort of like this word titular sort of undoes that honor. It makes it, or at least
so the chamberlain is really good. The titular chamberlain, he gets to wear the costume, but otherwise not so much.
Yeah. So he's just he's sort of like a pretend chamberlain. So so he had really an inconsequential jobs, but he seemed to really sort of, in his work with the Pope, he was able to maneuver into this very significant position of being...
He did make it more significant by taking on and asking for the task of delivering the Golden Rose to Frederick the Wise and entering into Germany and no longer being a part of just this insular papal court in Rome. Maybe because he has a German background, the Pope sends him.
Okay.
Maybe he recruited himself for the position, but he's tasked with delivering the Golden Rose to Frederick the Wise.
So what is this Golden Rose? Because this is something, and I don't know how many of our listeners watched the movie Luther. The movie came out, I'm going to say, about 15 years ago. And it was a good movie. It actually covered a lot of this ground. Very entertaining, especially for Lutherans. And but it was very well done. But they had this scene where they bring in the Golden Rose, right? And Frederick the Wise gets it, and he's like, But this Golden Rose was a big deal. It was something. At least when I was digging up what I could find on this Golden Rose, and it was really it wasn't awarded very often.
So you found 21 times between 1500 and 1600 the Pope delivered a Golden Rose to someone as an act of honor. Recipients could include a church, a sanctuary, someone of royalty, a military figure, to a government. It could go to an institution, or it could go to a person. Now,
at least what I found, they had a list of everybody the Rose went to for all time.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was looking through who it went to in the 1500s to try and get an idea of, who got these things. One of the things that was interesting was that King Henry VIII, who eventually broke from Rome, and created the Church of England, got 3 golden roses.
So it sounds like the golden rose was used by the popes in the 16th century to advance the position of Rome, to create and extend the Roman authority by saying, remember, you're a part of this. And so it confers honor, but it also is a little bit of a yoke, a reminder. I'm giving you something to remind you, you are a part of this church. Now, Henry VIII needed 3 of those, and still that wasn't enough.
It's sort of interesting that, the way the political ramifications of getting a golden rose, it's beautiful, it's important, but like you said, it's sort of as a yoke. It's like, okay, you're going to pull this wagon now, right? And that's at least between Henry VIII and Frederick the Wise, they saw it. At least it seems like they weren't really swayed.
They understood the politics. Compared to if you give it to someone who is younger or someone who isn't as wise in what is happening in Europe, they may see this as just, wow, I'm special. I'm so important. He noticed me. Yay, he noticed me. But maybe these guys are smarter. So let's figure out, maybe going back to episode 6, understand the timeline of how we got to where we're at. Where are we at? The Diet of Augsburg took place in the fall of 1518. Frederick the Wise, who is essentially Luther's governor, he's the noble that is in charge of Saxony.
And his protector. He was basically protecting Luther from, essentially the Pope, right?
Yeah. And while as Luther's being protected from the Pope by Frederick the Wise has also given indication that he may support the Pope in who the next emperor will be. So go ahead.
Well, this gets into Charles V of Spain, right? Mm-hmm. So Maximilian, let's take going back to episode 6, Maximilian is the current emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He wants his grandson to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. And so he's maneuvering to get all the pieces in place before he dies. Now, the problem is that the Pope does not want that for several reasons.
And we're going to talk a lot more in the next episode about the politics of Charles V and Francis I and maybe Henry VIII and their roles in becoming the next Holy Roman Emperor. But the key thing is that the Golden Rose is being delivered to Frederick the Wise because Frederick the Wise has given indications that he may support the Pope if the Pope allows Frederick to do what he wants to do with Luther.
Right.
And so there's kind of this push and pull between the Pope and Frederick the Wise. Give me Luther. I'm not going to give you Luther. I'm going to give you my support for this. And so there's some politics that are
horse
happening.
Trading. There's political horse trading that's going on between the Pope and Frederick the Wise, between Luther, and then who's going to be the next emperor, and Frederick is maneuvering, saying, "Listen, I'll give you I'll give you my vote for the emperor if you let me keep Luther." And it's okay.
Now, Miltitz was supposed to arrive at the same time as Cajetan and kind of work a good cop, bad cop sort of thing. Miltitz would be the good cop delivering the Golden Rose. Cajetan would be the bad cop, bringing a fatherly hearing to Luther, trying to get him to recant.
And that was actually sort of interesting because that whole fatherly quote, I'm doing air quotes here but air quotes of fatherly hearing, that was something that was negotiated by Frederick the Wise in the Diet of Augsburg in the fall of 1518. It sounds like the original plan was that Cajetan was going to be the bad cop. He was going to be,
take him back to Rome. Luther, you're in trouble. You're going back to Rome with me. And Miltitz would step in with the Golden Rose and bring maybe a political compromise. And somehow, Miltitz arrives late.
Yeah. And that's so, now the Diet of Augsburg is gone. Luther has skedaddled. Cajetan is furious, but he's negotiating with Frederick the Wise. All of a sudden, Miltitz shows up on Frederick the Wise's door.
Yeah. And so there's Miltitz, an ambitious man ready to take on this assignment He doesn't quite have the theological capability to tell Luther what he needs to recant. But Frederick the Wise does catch up with...
Miltitz catches up with Frederick the Wise at Altenburg.
So Altenburg is a city that's just a little bit south of Leipzig. And it's on the way back from Augsburg, kind of. And,
okay.
There is still today there in Altenburg kind of an interesting mixture. Altenburg today is a good expression of the East German state with a lot of block housing. The East German state got rid of the old downtown and built up all these concrete apartment blocks. And then at the end of the Berlin Wall falling and the reunification, Germany came in there with a lot of money to restore the downtown and eliminate some of that East German housing.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
So
Altenburg has been restored to its...
It has now, again, kind of a downtown.
Some of its former glory.
Yeah. So he catches up with Frederick the Wise there. Frederick knew the discussion with Cajetan had gone poorly, that things were turning against him and Luther, and he saw an opportunity with Miltitz to play for some time, extend. See, he had thought with Cajetan the negotiations had come to an end and things were accelerating to a great conflict. And with Miltitz, Frederick the Wise now has an opportunity to extend the negotiation. Where he thought it was the fourth quarter, the game was over and they had lost, and now they were picking up their gear and going home. Suddenly he finds there's an overtime.
Yeah, there's this guy who shows up who says, "Hey,
he doesn't know the game's over."
He doesn't know the game's over, and he says, "I'm willing to negotiate." And so Frederick the Wise sees this as an opportunity to, you know what? I'm ready to negotiate. Let's play ball here, and we'll keep this game going, and let's see what happens.
Now, so Frederick the Wise is calling Luther to Altenburg to negotiate with Miltitz. Now, so Luther writes about this conversation, and he says that in the greeting, Miltitz betrayed the counsel of his heart toward me when he said, "Oh, Martin, I believed you were some aged theologian who, sitting behind the stove, disputed thus with himself. Now I see you are still young and strong. If I had 25,000 armed men, I do not believe I could take you to Rome. For I have sounded out the people's mind all along the way to learn what they thought of you. Behold, where I found one standing for the Pope, 3 stood for you against the Pope." Miltitz is actually revealing the weakness of his position. Where Cajetan had come with the great magnificence of Rome and had made Luther feel like either you come with us or you're nothing, Miltitz reminds Luther of the negotiating position that Luther has. Miltitz essentially shares the playbook with Luther and says to Luther, "I've got nothing. What do you got?" Who plays poker like that?
That's worth a little drink here. So they come to a 4-point agreement, right?
Well, and it starts with Miltitz says to recant, and Luther says, "What do you want me to recant from?"
Yeah.
And Luther finds out Miltitz doesn't know theology and can't demonstrate any reason why he should recant. And so Luther says, "All right, you don't know why I should recant, so how about we just skip the recanting thing?" And so the 4-point agreement ends up having nothing to do with revoking, recanting, or pulling back any statements.
So the 4 points are, the first one was that Luther is going to apologize to the Pope.
For being too harsh.
For being too harsh. Not for actually what he said, but how he said it. Mm-hmm. Which is sort of an interesting... And then, so he says Luther's going to apologize to the Pope for being so vehement regarding indulgences. And the second point is he's going to encourage all to obedience.
This is an interesting thing. It demonstrates maybe in these 4 points, Luther hasn't come to a complete break yet. He still thinks that there is some worldly, human reasons to find obedience to the Pope. He has already disregarded any eternal spiritual relationship between the Pope and the everlasting church. But in this one, he's saying, for the sake of order, there may be a reason for obedience.
So he's putting that out there.
And the third point,
he's going to remain silent if his opponents remain silent.
So it's the idea of, I'm not going to accelerate the argument. I'm not going to keep arguing if they don't keep arguing.
So the interesting thing about this is, as you read through Luther and you read what he says 45 years, or I guess, was it 45 years later or 30 years later or whatever it is?
Between 1519, and then it's the preface to the writings of 1545 that he's writing.
Okay, so 25 years later, roughly. So roughly about 25 years later, he's recounting this, and this is the one point he remembers, or he really brings out.
Yeah.
He says, hey, I promised to be quiet if my opponents would be quiet. And this isn't the only time he says it. I was looking at his table talks and everything else, and he's constantly referencing this portion of the agreement. I've never seen him mention the other 3 points, but he comes to this point over and over again. I'll be quiet. And it seems like, looking back as he ages, this is the critical point, the one that I'm going to be quiet if my opponents will be quiet.
And that word quiet makes it sound like it's just a détente, just a mutual assured, not going to talk about it. But it's important to see Luther was a person who desired and was eager for peace. He did not like disturbance in the church. He worried about the witness this would give. And so, having been drawn into disturbances by force and driven by necessity to have the arguments that he did, he understood that it would be good for the church to have peace. That doesn't mean he was going to be silent about the gospel. It doesn't mean he was going to be silent about the hope and promise we should have in Jesus Christ through our faith and not by our works. But he wasn't going to attack.
So, and then sometimes I hear another point that there was a requirement to reprimand Tetzel. And that's sort of, I'm not entirely clear on that one.
Yeah, I read as well that Luther understood his silence was going to be contingent on Miltitz after visiting with him in Altenburg, then going to speak to Tetzel and speaking to Albert of Mainz, and assuring that they would be silent as well. So it's kind of like the beginning of Miltitz's journey through Germany was Luther. The next stop was Tetzel, and the next spot was supposed to be Albert of Mainz. You get these 3 guys to be quiet. We go forward.
All right. So they have this agreement. They finally, what happens next?
Well, that day, though, finishes with Miltitz maybe thinking that one of those things that they agreed to was a recanting. It's almost like in a speed of words, Miltitz thought he heard Luther was going to recant, and Luther never was going to recant. So the next day, when the letter that Luther was going to sign, speaking of his agreement to these 4 points, Miltitz notices there's nothing about recanting.
All right.
And so then at that point, Miltitz decides that the recantation wasn't absolutely necessary and that Luther should just stay quiet. So it's kind of Luther's pretty certain, here are the 4 points I agreed to. And it seems like Miltitz left that day thinking a recanting was still coming. And it never did, of course.
Right.
So Miltitz leaves. Luther goes. And so then Miltitz and Tetzel talk. Tetzel is the indulgence seller, who was the catalyst for the entire affair. He is a Dominican. Much of the arguments between Luther and any other bad guy, the bad guys are always the Dominicans. Luther is always saying the good guys are the Augustinians.
Right.
And those who are Catholic will understood that these different orders are not some monolithic all Rome. There is within them a difference between the friars of the Augustinians and the Dominicans.
Yeah, and for our Catholic listeners, we should probably be careful of having bad guys in all this.
Yes, that's right.
I guess the Catholic listeners, just take what we said, flip it around, and you'll be fine. So let's see. So then we get into, so Miltitz, actually, he does do what he said he's going to do, right? He goes from Luther, and the next stop is to go see Tetzel.
And
wait a second, they had dinner that night. That's one.
Luther and Miltitz have dinner. They have a great dinner,
and they had a wonderful time. Luther says what an enjoyable time he had. 25 years later, he's talking about this dinner that he had with Miltitz, and what a great time he had.
It does speak to the character of having table fellowship. And that sense of you can argue, you come to conclusion, and then you share and break bread together.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are talking about, and what's funny is that, and you see this over and over again, and we'll see it with the Leipzig debate coming up.
They're still collegial.
They're very collegial. It's when you consider that these are the questions that split the church in the West, right? That these are extremely significant questions. These people are still very collegial, so different from, we'll say, from today's political environment, right, where much smaller issues get people almost to fisticuffs. But it was definitely a different era. So they have this great dinner. Then the next day, Miltitz hops on his horse and off he goes, or in his carriage and off he goes.
Yeah, so he finds Tetzel, and he was vehement in his threats against Tetzel, saying that Tetzel had brought this tragedy to the church. And Luther later finds out about how Miltitz and Tetzel talked and how this had broken Tetzel. And so here's what Luther writes about this. He goes that when I found this out before his death, when I found out how much Tetzel was harmed by this conversation with Miltitz, he took it personally. Luther writes, I comforted him with a letter written benignly, asking him to be of good cheer and not to fear my memory. But perhaps he had come a victim of his conscience and of the Pope's indignation. Johann Tetzel, that indulgence seller who had provided the occasion for Luther to write the 95 Theses, he died in 1519 in July. So January 1519 is when Miltitz and Tetzel talk.
And Tetzel is dead within 8 months.
6 months.
6 months. So what we have here is, it's sort of hard for us to wrap our heads around it from Tetzel's perspective. And I had to give this some thought. You have to sort of, at least what I imagine, is you've got this guy. Tetzel's there. He's already, he's left his job of being an indulgence seller. And then this guy shows up from the Pope, somebody who has the authority to put people in jail and burn them at the stake and all sorts of things, and so Tetzel has this guy show up, and this guy is full of, threats and accusations, and Tetzel just fears for his life, and it eventually breaks him, and he dies a broken man. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that, Luther did the right thing, I think, saying, listen, this wasn't about you. Because Luther, right from the very beginning, says that this is about scholasticism. This is about bringing Aristotelian logic into Christianity and having God stand under logic, where God does not stand over and is not the supreme being.
That's what Luther was criticizing.
That's what Luther was actually criticizing. And this whole Tetzel thing was a sidebar to Luther.
I think it shows to me, with the way Luther and Tetzel and Karl von Miltitz address this, that fracturing the church is not something we should ever seek. We should never look for an opportunity to bring schism, disturbance, and frustration to the church. It may happen. In fact, it did happen here in the 16th century. But Tetzel's grieved by it. Luther's grieved by it. There is an ache in the heart when we cannot agree as brothers and sisters about what the church is for.
Yeah, and that's obvious even in this very charged environment. That's very real. That ache in the heart is very real for all the players.
Well, that's kind of a heavy way to finish this section, so let's break it up with a little beer break.
Okay, time for a beer break. Now what beer do we have this week?
So we've got, from a can, the Keweenaw Brewing Company, the Red Jacket Amber Ale. The idea of this coming from a can, it's we had an all-day session from a can.
We did.
But mostly it's from glass, but there is this delivery of cans for these craft brews is, feels strange. I feel like if it's going to be a fancy craft brew, it has to come from glass. But the can helps preserve it longer on the shelf.
Oh, is that? Well, I personally love the Keweenaw Brewing Company. Josh went there he went to his graduate from MTU.
Presumably, he's not a graduate of the Keweenaw Brewing Company.
I think he's that too.
He's that too. Okay.
I know. I graduated from the Keweenaw Brewing Company when I was up there. It's a beloved brewery up there in Houghton, Michigan.
Okay.
And it's a 9-hour drive from here from the.
So we
Brighton,
may
Ann
not
Arbor.
get a road trip there.
I don't think so. Although it's a good beer, it was one of the first. It was actually the first time I went to a brewery, and they didn't serve food. It's truly what they mentioned that it's truly a microbrewery.
So it's more like the beer garden idea that you'll go there to enjoy the beer.
Yeah, and I've seen that since, but that was the first place I went to that had there was just beer. And when you go, and if you want to get food, you have to go next door. There's a pizza place next door. It was still a great place to hang out.
And the can has the red copper color that is appropriate for the UP as well.
Oh, absolutely. So good beer. This is one of my favorites, and so I wanted to make sure that we got it on the show here.
So how do they refer to the Keweenaw Brewing Company shorthand? What would I show if I was a local? How would I refer to this?
Well, they call it KBC.
All right. So like in Wisconsin, you got the PBR. Pabst Blue Ribbon, so now KBC. I can add to my acronym.
Yeah, that's right. So now you can be an insider. I'm going to have a little KBC Amber Ale here. So this is excellent beer. Really enjoy this one.
It is an easy drink.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, before we go, we wanted to talk about something else that came up in the same era. It's from a different document that Luther...
It's from the same... So where he writes about von Miltitz... He also writes about his discovery of the righteousness of God. They're both from his preface to the Latin writings of 1545.
Okay.
So we're staying within the timeline of the event. We've been looking at different documents, starting with the 95 Theses in 1517, 1518, 1519. So we're talking about events that are in the winter of 1518 and 1519, but we're using... the document to kind of shape our conversation is Luther's preface to the Latin writings of 1545 that are found within volume 34 of Luther's works.
Now, one of the big things with Luther is he was always a little embarrassed about, and I think we may have mentioned this in previous episodes. Luther seems like he's always been a little embarrassed about his writings from this era.
Well, I think some of it is that there is not this just like crystal clear, this is what I'm writing about. There is a movement of his writing. And he is an occasional writer, is the way I heard someone describe it recently. It's not that he occasionally writes, like sometimes he's not going to write for a long time and then he writes, but he writes about occasions. So as an occasional writer, he's writing about the occasions that are happening in his life, which means that he doesn't always have a very systematic study of something. Instead, as an occasion happens, he writes about it.
And it makes it great for this kind of podcast, this kind of discussion where we're mixing the history, because you almost need to know the history to talk about the theology or Luther's specific
Because
writings.
he's responding so much to what is happening.
Right. Up until 1545, Luther's saying, hey, I don't want to write my, I don't want to gather everything together because there's so much garbage in there and so confusing, and we need something that's, let's just focus on stuff like the Augsburg Confession.
Yeah, and I think some of it's also his desire to point to the power of God's Word to work in his theology rather than him working in his theology.
Yeah, he says several times, burn all my books, burn everything. Just keep the Word of God. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of one of the things that he keeps hammering on. And this is another example. In 1545, he's saying, just throw it all out. I don't care.
So he doesn't throw it all out, though, thankfully for us.
Right.
So he agrees to publish his Latin works, and he writes as a preface to his Latin works a short summary of the major events in his life. So in the preface to the Latin works, he remembers back to the winter of 1518, 1519. So in the fall, November, October time of 1518, he's meeting with Cardinal Cajetan. January, 5, 6... Of January 5 and 6 of 1519, he's meeting with von Miltitz.
So this is right in between those two. This event that we're going to talk about next happens somewhere in that same time frame.
So as much as he's meeting with these representatives from Rome, he is also reading the Psalms. And he's getting ready to, in his look at the Psalms, to lecture about them. And as he's considering the Psalms, he is balancing and trying to understand the Psalms alongside of the recent work he's been doing studying St. Paul.
Now he's going through the Psalms, and there's a verse from St. Paul that really is sticking in his mind. It's chapter 1, verse 17.
And how does that read, Mike?
That one says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith."
And so Paul, as he's writing that to the Romans, is quoting Habakkuk chapter 2. So there is this already in Romans, Paul interacting with the Old Testament. And now Luther is using the same passage from Romans and Habakkuk and all of this soup of the New Testament to interact with the Psalms.
So Luther writes, and I'm going to read what Luther wrote in his Latin preface to the Latin works. He says, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he would be placated with my satisfaction. I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners." So it's he's talking about the righteous shall live by faith, I think, is really what he's referencing, this term, the righteous shall live by faith. And he knew he was not righteous, that he was a sinner, that he had sinful thoughts, he had sinful desires, he had that constantly having sinful impulses, and whereas poorly placed words, didn't help the poor when he walked by them, whatever it was, he felt very
he felt under attack,
yes,
that he justly deserves the wrath and punishment of God. And this balance of the righteous, the faithful, and the righteousness of God, he hears these words and he doesn't measure up.
Now, one of the things that a lot of folks, especially non-Lutherans, might have trouble with is the idea, Luther's idea of like the Ten Commandments, because I know when I was a Catholic, I didn't have the same sort of training on the Ten Commandments that the Lutherans have on the Ten Commandments. And what Luther does in his large catechism is he goes through and he I think it's like 50 pages, 40 pages of just the Ten Commandments.
That's the largest section in the large catechism.
And he just And he basically, you get a view of Luther's idea on the Ten Commandments and what he was measuring himself against when he was at this point.
Yeah.
And
as Luther writes about the Ten Commandments, there is going to be no minimizing. There's going to be no reducing. There's no changing of the measuring stick so that you can get far enough. If you're going to run a 100-meter race, you can't make it 90 meters and say you finished. It has to be 100 meters. And the law is in its full weight against Luther here. So just to look at, for instance, the fifth commandment, as the way Luther numbered them. I know that those who might be from a Presbyterian or Baptist background will number the commandments differently. But in Lutheran and Catholic Church, the fifth commandment is you shall not murder. And so start with the basic. It's against the law to unjustly kill anyone.
Okay, so that one makes sense. So, but Christ goes further.
Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Christ looks at each of the commandments. And what does he say about there is it's not just about the action, it's about a motive. It is not appropriate to condemn or judge another. That would be the same as to murder. To call your brother a fool is as...
So character assassination is sin.
Well, and to call a fool actually is to look back in the Proverbs and to say a fool believes in heart there is no God. To call your brother a fool is to call him someone who doesn't believe in God.
Oh,
so it's not just to call him like a jester or call him a silly guy. To call someone a fool is to say they don't even have the wisdom to believe in God.
So this is actually, I'm going to say in today's day and age that would be considered even more subtle. So these subtle, that your faith is not strong enough. I would assume that would also. So Luther is feeling this, and that's just one law.
So then both of these are about the negatives, the prohibitions of the law. Don't actually kill anybody unjustly, and don't destroy someone with your words. But then Luther looks at each of the commandments also and sees a positive attribution towards behavior that is directed to us. So it's not only that we don't unjustly kill, but we should find a way to say a good word about our neighbor.
So then Luther's looking at it and he's saying, well, did I say a good word about so-and-so? Did I say a good word about so-and-so? Was I always looking at things from the best possible perspective that puts people in the best possible light? Well, no, I wasn't.
And he does this exercise for each of the 10 commandments, looking at them in all of their subtlety. And how, for instance, in the 6th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. It's a sin to be attracted to somebody other than your spouse. That's adultery, to have lust in your heart. It's a sin to be proud of yourself for doing something good.
So these sins are piling up on Luther.
And it's easy to see why this would create an extremely disturbed conscience. And his inability to be able to meet the 10 commandments, to go all 100 meters in the race, then runs him up against this quote from St. Paul in Romans. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as written, the righteous shall live by faith.
So one way of looking at that, the righteous shall live by faith, is that, well, you have... What was Luther saying here when he's complaining about that? It's that you don't have to have the 10 commandments, not just the 10 commandments. On top of that is now the gospel has become a law, right?
So to look at, one is, merit of doing something because you are morally good. It is just the beginning of things. Anybody can eventually develop the habit in relationship to their neighbor to be morally right with their neighbor.
Okay.
You take it, the next step is, can you have faith? And this is that almost that the character of the church was to direct people to moral rightness. And maybe the select few can have a devotional heart.
So now there's a new law.
Well, what Luther has always been seeing is that moral behavior is good, and a few people will actually have a devotional heart. And now it had been seen for many that first part, moral behavior, would be enough, and it's almost like a bonus to have the devotional heart. But now he finds out what he had been thinking of as a bonus. That devotional heart becomes of necessity.
When he reads that, and
the righteous shall live by faith. He thinks to be morally right means not only do you know the moral behavior that's expected of you, but that righteous person that knows those moral behaviors will also have faith. And so this means that there is no wiggle room. It's not like you can just train someone in the habits of moral behavior. The righteous shall live by faith is an accusation that you must have faith.
So now I'm going to read Luther's next little section here. It goes when his reaction to this, as he's considering this, and he's thinking about, gee, I've got this new law I've got to fulfill. He says, it is not enough that miserable sinners eternally lost through original sin are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the 10 Commandments, without God adding pain to pain by the gospel, when the gospel threatens us with his righteousness and wrath. And it's a paraphrase a little bit, but that's...
Well, and the righteous shall live by faith, we see as such a hopeful thing. But faith was seen not as a gift from God. Faith was seen as a work that you would develop within your heart. And that's why it was such an accusation. When we hear faith, we hear gift. When I hear faith, I hear God, through the Holy Spirit, calling, gathering, and enlightening me to believe in Jesus Christ. When Luther, before this winter of 1518, 1519 that he's writing about, when he talked about faith, he was talking about an activity of a person in their actions and in their words and their heart. So this is a tough spot for Luther, because he is hearing judgment not only against moral behavior, which he had always understood, but he just can't get away from the fact that God is even bringing him to judgment against his faith. So he has to deal with this.
So he's thinking about this. He's thinking about this, and what I'm just going to go back to 25 years later, during when he's writing, he's looking back on this. And
he introduces what you're about to read, saying, "At last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words."
So now he says he's looking at it totally wrong. God. Now he's saying that, as he looks at the context, he says that it's not God isn't demanding us to be perfectly righteous in his thoughts and actions and our thoughts and actions, but that God recognizes that that's beyond our capabilities. So now Luther is saying that when Paul says the righteousness of God is revealed, he's going back to that. The righteousness of God is revealed. The previous couple of
he looks in the context. This is a great thing for anybody that's getting to a tough passage in Scripture, and you're confounded by what the words say. The first thing I ask you to do, look at the context.
So now he's looking at the context. He's looking at the righteousness
righteous shall live by faith. He looks at in context of
the righteousness of God shall be revealed.
So now righteousness of God is not an activity of me.
Right. Now
it's an activity of God.
This is the righteousness of God is revealed, and the righteousness shall live by faith. So now it's that linkage that now all of a sudden he sees he sees his doctrine of a passive righteousness, that it's God's righteousness is active, and we
are receiving it.
We're receiving it.
This definition of righteousness as a character, an attribute, an action of God that moves into this world and changes poor, lost, condemned sinners. That's what we're talking about today in the second half of our podcast. How Luther takes this phrase, the righteousness of God, and removes it from the context of wrath and fury and puts it in the context of promise.
And gift.
Gospel. The gospel for him now is not something that is an attack, but is something that changes us. And he says, "Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. Their totally other face of the entire Scripture showed itself to me. Thereupon I ran through the Scriptures from memory, and I found in other terms an analogy, the work of God, that is, what God does in us, the power of God which makes us strong, the wisdom of God with which he makes us wise, the strength of God, the salvation of God, the glory of God." Luther is talking about an awakening that he is finding rooted not in just some mystical experience, but in reading the Word of God.
So basically what this is that this gets back to the concept of all good things come from God, that wisdom comes from God, and that it's God's wisdom that is passively given to us, and that when we have our own ideas, that they tend to be wrong. That it's
and this puts the context of his discussion of the law now into place. Why is he so insistent on not changing the measuring mark of the law and describing the law in its full weight and its full judgment? Is because we need to know how utterly lost we are and how much we need the gift of the righteousness of God. There's not one inkling, not one spark, not one thing within me that can turn towards God.
And it's one of those things when you're looking at Lutheran theology or the Lutheran doctrine on sin, on the Ten Commandments, they pile it on. Luther piles it on. It's sort of like, every little thing is just another sin. If you turn to the right, it's a sin. If you turn to the left, it's a sin. If you look up, it's a sin. If you look down, it's a sin. No matter what you do, it's sinful. There's only a very narrow path that's left. And what this does is, and Lutheran theology,
he shines a big light on that narrow path, and that narrow path
is a gift.
It's the gift of Jesus.
It's a gift.
And so he calls the righteousness of God passive righteousness. What does this mean?
Well, first of all, it means that, for example, all our good works are tainted by sin, right?
Everything I do for my neighbor without God in my life is tainted by the vanity of trying to save myself or protect myself. Every good thing is, in fact, tainted by sin and imperfect before God. So
when we go to passive righteousness, an active righteousness would come from inside of us, and that would be tainted so that's why this everything from within us, that all good works, even the good works that come from us, are tainted by sin.
The only good work is that work which is done in the name of Christ and through Christ. Any other work is not sufficient.
And so every good work has to be perfect because God is perfect.
And now this is all dealing with the vertical relationship. It's helpful in this discussion of passive righteousness that Luther is describing that vertical relationship we have with God, which makes us right with God and gives us the eternal promise of paradise with God. In that horizontal relationship, that relationship you will have, Mike, with your neighbor, you can be nice to your neighbor and not know Jesus.
Sure.
Now, the motive, the inner heart that describes why you are doing that for your neighbor, that could be tainted by sin. But the fact that you help your neighbor rake his leaves, well, that's helpful to your neighbor one way or the other.
Sure. But this is one is to bring glory to myself, and one is to bring glory to God, and they both look the same from the outside. I'm raking the leaves.
So this passive exchange happens because I know I need it. This gift is ours, and the call of Romans 1:17 now isn't faith as a work. Faith is one more thing you got to do. Now faith is just receiving the gift.
So, and that's one of the things, even on his deathbed, and
he writes on a piece of paper, and he's holding in his hand, we are all beggars, that is for sure. We all are standing before the cross. We're all kneeling before the cross. We're all at the cross begging for the mercy of Jesus Christ, because we know that nowhere else in all of eternity is found our hope.
So this is the reason we spent so much time talking about this is because this is a major turning point in Luther's life. This realization of passive righteousness. This continues to reverberate through today, and in our ecumenical discussions, it really still comes back to this point, this moment when Luther realized that this doctrine of passive righteousness.
Now, Luther is never one, again, to cause schism or disruption in the church. So as he's coming to this reading of the Psalms and this reading of to Romans, he doesn't want to just be something completely innovative. There should be some assurance, he believes, that what he has found in the Word should have been seen by someone else before him. It's always sketchy. If you read the Word of God and you come up with something that no one else has ever seen in the Word, maybe your reading is wrong. And so Luther looks back at St. Augustine, and he finds in St. Augustine's book, The Spirit in the Letter, he says, contrary to, I found, he too interpreted God's righteousness in a similar way as the righteousness with which God clothes us when he justifies us. So Luther finds that his teaching, his comfort, his hope in the righteousness of God is in fact in continuity with Augustine.
So this is, I think that is the critical thing, and that's part of the reason why he was willing to risk death even for this. He saw it in line not just as a revelation for himself, but he saw it as a revelation that harkened back to Augustine. Was what, 400 AD? Yeah. Something like that. I mean, this is a teaching that was part of the church for over 1,000 years, but it had been.
Yeah, with the age of scholasticism that begins with Thomas Aquinas, 12th century, and the introduction of Aristotle into Europe, reason and logic really started to silence and mute the Word of God, and Luther is bringing it back. Well, what a wonderful episode we've had. We've enjoyed the KBC. Maybe I tried too hard.
No, you said KBC's Red Jacket Amber Ale, excellent beer. I want to say our thank yous. Thanks to our sound guy, Josh.
We appreciate St. Paul Lutheran Church and support and encouragement we're receiving there.
Hamburg, Michigan, and that's Missouri Synod. We also want to recognize our source materials. A couple of them that I really liked was Luther, A Guide for the Perplexed. That has a lot of good little nuggets in there of history and what things were happening around the discussions.
And then a biography by James Kittleson called Luther the Reformer. Then also volume 34 of Luther's works and volume 48.
Yeah, 48 I think was the one with the Latin preface was, I think.
Well, that's 40. In 34.
Oh, that's in 34. Okay.
But he also writes in some of his table talk and other things.
That's what it was. That's what it was. Of course, the good people at the Catholic Encyclopedia. And Luther's Large Catechism, I think everybody picked that one up.
Encyclopedia.com, a great resource if you're looking for some more Reformation nuggets of good stuff. Reformation500.csl.edu. This is the Reformation website that Concordia Seminary in St. Louis has prepared. Reformation500.csl.edu.
That's a great website. I really enjoy that one. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can shoot us an email at graceontap.podcast@gmail.com.
GraceOnTap-podcast.com is our website where you can go to find any of the episodes or any other extra articles we add. And we also have a Facebook page that you can find. Just type in the Facebook search bar Grace on Tap, and I think we're the first group that comes up.
Yeah, it certainly says, I think it might highlight it as podcast or something, or it might be a guy with a book out there or something called Grace on Tap. But and then what we would really welcome any reviews you put on iTunes. Those reviews really help out.
They make our podcast more visible to others as well, and gives people a sense of what they're signing up for.
And also, if you have any suggestions, anything, we'd love to hear from you.
Have a great day.
I think that does it. Thanks.